We are going to start in a rather unexpected place. We are going to start in the year 215 BC, during the Second Punic War. Rome is fighting Carthage.
Yeah, Alina, you have to unmute him.
Yep, sorry.
Myself. How's this?
Okay, yeah, sorry about that.
All right. So 215.
Shit. Unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Okay, I'll just keep unmuting myself. And everybody else, do Alina and me a favor and mute yourselves so she doesn't have to do it all the time. Thank you much. Anyway, Second Punic War. Rome is getting its ass handed to it. Hannibal is walking all over Italy. Romans are barely hanging on. And meanwhile, off the coast of Tarentum, a Roman patrol vessel intercepts a ship of an Athenian merchant named Xenophon, who has just negotiated a treaty with Hannibal on behalf of King Philip V of Macedon. Captured with Xenophon and the Carthaginian officers accompanying him are the diplomatic correspondence and the draft text of the treaty. The envoys and the documents are sent to Rome. The Senate reinforces the defeat at Tarentum and orders a further investigation as to whether the king of Macedon is indeed planning to join the war. He is. And the Romans had no idea. So at this point, Rome is on the ropes. And now the entry of Macedon into the war, opening a second front from the east, so to speak, is averted by basically luck of the draw. And overall, it's a very telling situation, because military and political intelligence of Republican Rome sucked balls. Republican structures in general were not conducive to development of any standing intelligence organization. Both city and provincial magistrates were replaced annually. They were not assisted by any permanent civil service and relied on personal friends and relations. Armies were also impermanent, troops being levied annually. The Senate had claim on intelligence and foreign policy as its domain and principle, but the Senate itself had no permanent officials or standing committees, its executive officers being the same magistrates whose annual election was seen as the principal safeguard of the Constitution. The senators were fiercely jealous of each other and of each other's specialized intelligence. And in the words of the Roman historian Livy, a clandestine organization is never accountable to anyone but itself, which constitutes a threat to the Republic. Just kidding, it wasn't Livy who said that, it was actually Harry Truman responding to JFK's assassination. But the principle, I suppose, is the same. But nothing will make people re-examine their ideas about security faster than a full-blown disaster. And for Rome, the disaster came calling in 390 BC. Sweeping down from northern Italy, the Gauls brushed aside an army that had been sent to bar their way 12 miles north of Rome at the Allia River. Although rumors and messengers from the neighboring Etruscans had repeatedly warned the Romans of the Gauls' approach, the defenders had barely reached the banks of Allia before they were taken by surprise with the awesome Celtic charge. The Roman stragglers fled back to the city in such haste that they neglected to close the Colline gate. The young and physically able took refuge in the citadel, while the elders of the city chose to stay behind and sacrifice themselves to slow down the invaders. They did. The Gauls were surprised to find the lower city empty. They sent off patrols to find out what the Romans were up to. Eventually, they entered the city, slaughtered the elder senators who stayed behind, and burned the city to the ground. Only the citadel held out. You can see it here in red, the Capitolium. So the Romans had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline, and the Gauls laid a siege that was to last 7 months. By watching Roman messengers sneak in and out of the city, the Gauls eventually discovered a cliffside trail leading up to the stronghold, and on a starlit night, they began their ascent. They were detected neither by the dogs nor by the sleeping Romans. Only the cackling of the geese, who were sacred to Juno, aroused Marcus Manlius and the city's defenders, who then drove the invaders off the walls and saved the city from sure and ignominious defeat. So this is a famous apocryphal story, yes, but it's very telling because early warning and advanced intelligence weren't really a part of Republican Rome's defensive system. But the capture and sack of Rome left a deep mark on Roman folk memory. Allia Day, commemorating the battle at the river, became a day of evil omen. For the next 5 centuries, on Allia Day, a procession was held in which geese were carried on litters of purple and gold, a reward for the service they had rendered as an early warning system, while dogs were impaled or crucified on altar stakes. The effect the Gallic defeat had on the Roman psyche manifested itself in more tangible ways too. The Senate ordered a massive stone wall built around the city, 12 feet thick, 24 feet high, and 5.5 miles in circumference. And it is against these walls that we find Hannibal stomping about 170 years later during the Second Punic War. So how has it come to that? Romans of the late Republic liked broadcasting the view that their ancestors had been virtuous and upright people of fides, faith, who abhorred strategy and trickery. Were they in truth morally opposed to activities such as clandestine collection and covert operations? I don't think so. The early Republic of the 5th and 4th centuries BC was facing more than enough threats from the Gauls, the Equi, the Volsci, the Etruscans, to prompt the development of true defensive mechanisms. And despite their protests to the contrary, we do find Romans collecting intelligence and using it in operations to help in their defense. But primarily, they were fond of divination. The Romans employed many types of divination, especially the reading of auspices, to determine the appropriate course of action in both political and military situations. Augury, or taking of the auspices, meant observing the flights of birds and interpreting their position and cries. For public auspices on solemn state occasions, such as before the founding of a colony or before the declaration of war, a magistrate, accompanied by one of the members of the College of 15 Augurs, would take his seat in the open and watch for a sign. In Rome, there was a special site, the Auguraculum in the capital, which was reserved for that purpose. In some cases, magistrates went to great lengths to avoid knowing what the gods had wished. Marcus Claudius Marcellus supposedly drove to battle in a covered wagon so as not to see unfavorable signs. On military campaigns, if birds were not available, the sacred chickens were carried around and consulted by special chicken handlers called the pulari. To consult the sacred chickens, the cage was opened and a cake of grain was thrown in front of them. It was a bad sign if the chickens would not eat or behaved petulantly, but if they gobbled it up and bits fell from their beaks, or as the Romans would say, if the grain danced, then the undertaking had divine approval. Of course, it didn't take long before a practical commander, saddled with a useless and archaic ritual he could not publicly ignore, chose instead to rely on hard intelligence while keeping a facade of religious observance. Livy, and this time I really mean Livy, not President Truman, tells of a frustrated Claudius Pulcher who, before the Battle of Drepanum in 249 BC during the First Punic War, was anxious to engage in combat, but the chickens would not eat. Impatiently, he threw them into the water, saying, "Well, if they don't eat, let them drink." Thus, he defied the gods in a blasphemous manner, giving rise to a very real danger that his soldiers would lose their confidence, because they undoubtedly did believe in the signs and would hence move into action, haunted by premonitions of evil. In any event, Pulcher's army was defeated, and the omen was vindicated. But cooking intelligence is a timeless practice. Collectors of intelligence, even in antiquity, knew exactly what their leaders wanted to hear. So we see magistrates underfeeding the sacred chickens in order to produce favorable signs. During the Samnite Wars in the late 4th century BC, Pularius took the auspices knowing that the commander and the army were anxious to fight. Even though the chickens would not eat, the priest claimed that the auspices were favorable, and when a deserter provided information that 20 cohorts of Samnites were approaching, the Romans marched out to battle buoyed up by the knowledge that the gods were on their side. Along the way, a dispute broke out among the chicken handlers concerning the falsified report. A Roman cavalryman overheard the argument and reported it to the consul, Papirius, who thanked the cavalryman for the diligence, but had no intention of changing the plans. As for me, said the consul, I was told that the grain has danced. It is an excellent omen for the Roman people and the army. And then he ordered the centurion to position the chicken handlers in the front ranks. When the battle began, a random javelin struck the chicken keeper and he fell dead before the standards. Papirius believed that the gods were thus present at the battle and that the liar had paid the penalty for falsifying the auspices. As proof of this, a raven flew in front of the consul and uttered a clear cry, another favorable sign from heaven that the gods were pleased. Victory followed. We may doubt the historicity of the tale, but it shows that the Romans of Livy's day were very aware of the dangerous prospects that some intelligence collectors might be inclined to say whatever their superiors wanted to hear. Francinus describes the era of 4th and 3rd century BC as a time when, quote, shrewd methods of reconnoitering were still unknown to Roman leaders. Of course, he was not entirely correct. Literature is full of traitors, deserters, refugees, even spies. Occasionally, the Romans used disguise, and as the Roman army grew larger and more sophisticated, the commanders kept themselves informed by detailing scouts. But it was all very ad hoc. And not until the days of Caesar do we have accounts of scouting and reconnaissance techniques applied methodically. So it's not surprising that the war with Hannibal, who was a master strategist, went real bad. In the First Punic War, the Roman Republic and Carthage, the two main powers in Western Mediterranean, clashed for the first time. The war lasted 23 years, making it the longest war in ancient history and also the greatest naval war in the ancient world. Carthage was defeated and ceded Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia to Rome, making those the first Roman holdings outside of Italy. But the struggle was far from over. In 219 BC, Hannibal Barca besieged, captured, and sacked a pro-Roman city of Saguntum in Spain, right there, if you can see it, prompting a Roman declaration of war on Carthage in spring 218. That same year, Hannibal surprised the Romans by marching his army overland from Iberia through Gaul and over the Alps into northern Italy. Just that, in and of itself, speaks volumes about how unprepared the Romans had been. Initially, they sent a consular army with 60 warships to Spain, intending to fight Hannibal there. Just as the consul was preparing to leave Rome, envoys from an allied city of Massilia arrived, telling the Romans that Hannibal had crossed the Ebro on the way north. Change of plans. The Romans sailed to Massilia, right here, still having no clue about Hannibal's plans. They arrive and learn that the enemy is already past the Pyrenees. In fact, at the time, Hannibal was less than 50 miles away from Massilia, ferrying his army across Rome north of the Delta using smoke signals to coordinate the crossings. The Romans were unaware that he moved 50,000 men together with cavalry, baggage, and goddamn elephants, for fuck's sakes, right under their goddamn noses. The Romans discovered Hannibal's whereabouts only by chance. A Carthaginian reconnaissance patrol of 300 Numidian horsemen stumbled into about 200 Roman cavalry on a similar mission. After a savage encounter in which the Numidians were defeated, the Romans pursued Hannibal's men back to their camp. The Roman reconnaissance group reported the size of Hannibal's encampment to the consul, who assumed that Hannibal was about to attack. He concentrated the forces, blew trumpets, let the flags fly, and returned to the enemy camp, only to find it abandoned. Then finally, the horrifying truth dawned on them. Hannibal's destination was Italy. The Carthaginians were one step ahead of the Romans all along, and since the Romans had no intelligence network for crossing the Alps, no contacts with the tribes, no maps, no supplies for such crossing, nothing, they went back to their ships and returned to northern Italy to meet Hannibal when he descended from the mountains. Once in Italy, Hannibal proceeded to give the Roman army a sound thrashing. Then another one, but perhaps most importantly, he strove to isolate Rome from its allies. Most of Italy at this time was not yet Roman territory. It was a conglomeration of independent autonomous states joined under a vague Roman primacy. So Hannibal, devising his own brand of psychological warfare, strove to drive a wedge between Rome and the other indigenous communities of Italy. From his first appearance on Italian soil, he announced that he had not come to fight against the peoples of the peninsula, but to liberate them from Roman domination. And after every battle, he released without ransom any non-Romans who had been taken prisoner so that they would spread the word in their native regions about Hannibal's political goals and his generosity. Such gestures were instrumental in recruiting local troops and depriving Rome of potential allies. A different aspect of psychological warfare to which Hannibal gave much attention was the construction of psychological profiles. Learning the frame of mind of the Roman commanders, exploiting their attitudes to his own advantage. For example, when the consul Longus came to bar his way from northern Italy, Hannibal was able, through his Celtic agents, to discover that the consul was desperate for a spectacular victory, to vindicate the Romans for their lapses. Hannibal's Gallic spies were very productive sources since they were Gauls in both camps. They reported that the consul was anxious to join the battle, and so Hannibal built on Longus's impatience by luring him into a trap at Trebia River, which is a perfect ambush location. He carefully selected the grounds to make maximum use of surprise and maneuver. The battle was fought utilizing every advantage of terrain, weather, and psychology that Hannibal could bring to bear. Longus and his troops were annihilated. The Romans then elected the popular and experienced General Gaius Flaminius as consul for 217. His mandate was to intercept and stop Hannibal and to do it quickly, before the invader caused any serious damage. Flaminius positioned himself on the western road to Rome, which ran along the Tyrrhenian coast, hoping to block Hannibal's march south. Hannibal outmaneuvered Flaminius, bypassed the zone, leaving the embarrassed consul behind to receive accounts of Hannibal's men descending on rich Tuscan villages like bikers on a microbrewery. The psychological torture was too much for Flaminius. He rushed after Hannibal and was lured into yet another ambush at the location of the enemy's choosing. A trap was set at Lake Trasimene. From information brought by his cavalry and perhaps from Etruscan peasants who knew the district, Hannibal had an accurate picture of the terrain. The intelligence enabled him to lure Flaminius into a narrow defile, north shore of the lake. The slaughter was appalling. Over 15,000 Romans were killed, an equal number taken prisoners, and the victory sent the Carthaginians on their merry way down the Apennines. When the command of Roman troops again changed, and Quintus Fabius Maximus became dictator, he avoided meeting Hannibal in pitched battle and instead began a long, tedious game of cat and mouse, which earned him the nickname Cunctator, or the delayer. The strategy itself was quite clever, because he was not just avoiding Hannibal, but rather he was restricting Hannibal's movements and thereby his ability to provision. But the strategy annoyed many Romans, who wanted to see the honor of their legions upheld. Rumors spread that Fabius was in the pay of the Carthaginians, and Hannibal used the situation for yet another psychological manipulation. When his scouts picked up on the rumors, Hannibal deliberately avoided lands owned by Fabius while burning everything around them. That Hannibal could identify which lands belonged to Fabius, was in itself an impressive feat of intelligence gathering. Not only did his scheme lend credence to the stories, but it also made Fabius so conscious of the damage to his own credibility that he signed over his lands to the state to prevent further speculation against him. By contrast, the Romans are mostly seen stumbling across vital information, if they're lucky. And here we come back to the story with which we started this talk: Rome's fortuitous interception of the Macedonian embassy to Hannibal. In fact, the ambassadors of King Philip were initially detained on their way to the Carthaginian camp by a Roman patrol near Capua, and were brought to the Roman praetor Valerius Lavinius. But the sneaky fox were able to convince the Roman magistrate that their intention was to make an alliance not with Carthage, but with Rome. Lavinius was fooled by their story and provided them not only with food, but even with the exact location of Hannibal's camp. The ambassadors went directly to Hannibal and presented him with Philip's offer of alliance. The envoys had no such luck on their way back. The ship was boarded by the Roman naval patrolmen. The agreement and letter from Hannibal to Philip were found and confiscated. The ambassadors were taken prisoner, and a disaster of having to fight a war on yet another front was averted. Their very survival was at stake, and the Romans had no choice but to adopt Hannibal's intelligence tactics. The first indication we have of a Roman signaling system is from the Battle of Arpi in Apulia in 213 BC, where the Romans operated their own network of relays to transmit military information. Other incidents also suggest that they were learning. They were learning how to counter some of Hannibal's ploys. For example, when Hannibal defeated and killed the consul Marcellus, he immediately took the consul's ring. The Romans, remembering Hannibal's skill at forging correspondence, acted swiftly and broadcast to neighboring city-states that Marcellus had died, that his ring was in enemy hands, and that henceforth no letters ostensibly written by him should be trusted. Just then, such a letter reached the city of Salapia, carried by a Roman deserter pretending to be the late consul's messenger. The dispatch, sealed with the consul's ring, asked the Salapians to be ready for Marcellus's arrival. So when the phony advance guard turned up, in reality a unit of Roman deserters, it was welcomed into the city. The Salapians then closed the gates, set upon the deserters, and killed them. Still, the Romans direly needed a competent leader who could act as a central coordinator and chief of intelligence, someone who could not be too squeamish about adopting the very methods that had afforded Hannibal success. They found their man in Publius Cornelius Scipio. Conservatism and constitutional niceties had to be laid aside. The Romans were desperate. For the first time now, they had a military strategist who was a match for the enemy. Scipio deserves credit for one of the most daring exploits in the Hannibalic Wars, a surprise attack on the Carthaginian base of New Carthage, these days known as Cartagena. Not this Cartagena, this Cartagena, the real Cartagena. The city had an excellent harbor and served as a logistics center, where the Carthaginians kept the bulk of their money and war material for the Spanish theater, as well as hostages taken from Spain. Scipio's reconnaissance was meticulous. He studied the plan of the city and observed that the level of water in the lagoon fell each evening. He took advantage of this natural phenomenon in timing his action. 500 men with ladders crossed the shallow lagoon at night and scaled the walls in a frontal assault at the moment when they were least expected. The following year, 208 BC, Scipio's prowess showed again at the Battle of Baecula, where he defeated Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal and destroyed most of his cavalry. After Hasdrubal's flight from Baecula, Scipio continued the Roman offensive in Spain, routing 2 more Carthaginian armies, eventually landing in Africa and defeating Hannibal himself at the Battle of Zama. So, Scipio was the first to introduce espionage on a systemic level. When his siege of Utica was stalled, he sent a legation to the camp of the Numidian king Syphax, the chief ally of the Carthaginians. Scipio's emissaries were accompanied by centurions disguised as slaves. One of these officers was even publicly caned to protect his cover, lest anyone should recognize him as per Roman custom. Only social inferiors were subject to corporal punishment. This is the first mention of officers taking active part in an espionage mission. While the legates were in conference, the slaves were to wander about the camp in different directions and reconnoiter the premises, taking note of entrances, exits, the location of each division. They were to look for outposts and sentries and to determine whether the camp was more vulnerable to attack by day or by night. On each visit, a different group of slaves made the trip so that every centurion would have an opportunity to familiarize himself with the ground. When all the information was at hand, Scipio decided to burn the Carthaginian and Numidian camps. The Carthaginians, thinking it was an accidental fire, ran out unarmed, only to be slaughtered by the Roman column that was ready and waiting. The head camp of Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Syphax were completely destroyed, and thus by a single stroke, which claimed no Roman casualties, Scipio delivered a crippling blow to a superior foe, albeit not without criticism of his sneaky behavior. The Romans went quite away from running in disarray from the enemy, forgetting to lock the gates of their city. They were learning. But still, so long as Rome remained a republic, intelligence collection and dissemination remained impromptu affairs that were run by a bunch of amateurs. There was little geographical data to go by. Some travelers' accounts were available, such as Pythias's travel to Britain and the Northern Ocean beyond it, and Diodorus tells us of the visits of a merchant Iambulus to an island, perhaps Ceylon, which he reached via Ethiopia, and where he recorded the nature and habits of the natives. But the Romans were aware how limited and unreliable these accounts are. Plautus parodies them in his plays, and Strabo expresses doubt that you can reach the mouth of the Caspian Sea if you travel along the northern coast of Germany, as some adventurers have apparently claimed. This map here is depicting Rhineland, northern Spain, and the southern coast of Britain. And I challenge you to guess which is which. This is why, for information about specific current situations in areas beyond Roman control, the Senate relied on the client states and allies, which Rome accumulated in the Middle and Late Republic. Information also came from embassies. Best known of all, of course, is Cato's embassy to Carthage in 153. The Roman ambassadors went beyond talking. They inspected the city and the surrounding territory, noted the stockpiling of arms and ship timber, and concluded that the resurgence of Carthage after the Second Punic War had reached a stage where she was once again a threat to Rome, and Carthago delendum esse had to be destroyed. Cato dramatically made his point in the Senate by letting some Libyan figs drop out of his toga and announcing that they had been grown only 3 days sail away from Rome. But still, the provincial governors, at the end of the day, were responsible for their own intelligence. Caesar's commentary to the Gallic War, wait, not this Caesar, the other Caesar. Caesar's commentary, sorry, of the Gallic War give an indication of how much control over senatorial as well as public opinion a republican commander could have by controlling the flow of information to Rome. Just as Cato had been able to basically frighten the Senate into seeking the destruction of Carthage, Caesar was able to use his dispatches and his commentary to justify the conquest of the whole of Gaul by emphasizing the threat from the migrating Helvetii, the Germans, and the hostile Gallic tribes out there somewhere. Prior to his British campaign, Caesar summoned merchants who traded with Britain and interrogated them. He asked all the appropriate questions: the size of the island, the number and strength of the tribes in it, their mode of fighting, their customs, what harbors there were. Nothing. He got nothing. He might as well have been embarking into deep space. Having obtained no information of value from the traders, Caesar decided to send off the tribune Volusianus on a 5-day reconnaissance with a single ship. Evidently, he picked the wrong man. Volusianus spent 5 days cruising along the south coast of Britain without actually landing, and making only a visual reconnaissance, which formed the subject of his report. With his typical acerbic humor, Caesar commented that Volusianus learned as much as was possible for a man who did not dare to leave the ship. This sad state of affairs concerning Republican intelligence is made clear by Cicero's misadventures in Cilicia, a newly acquired Roman province in Asia Minor. Cicero was appointed the governor of Cilicia in 51 and arrived in a state of total ignorance. Having entered on July 31st, 2 weeks later, he told his friend Atticus that there was no news of the Parthian invasions threatening the province, although travelers reported that Roman cavalry had been caught up in Syria. On August 31st, a month after entering the province, he complained to his predecessor, Appius Claudius Pulcher, that he still didn't know the exact whereabouts of his troops and could not trace 3 of the province's cohorts. Then, on 3rd of September, Cicero received the first hard news from envoys of Antiochus, king of Commagene, who told him that Pacoros of Parthia had advanced to the Euphrates and was crossing en route to invade Syria, and that now there were rumors that Artavisdes of Armenia was about to invade Cappadocia. I don't have time to go into this circus in full detail, although it's a fascinating story. So I'll just fast forward and tell you that Cicero rushed for the Syrian capital, for Antioch, with his army, or at least those units of it that he could find, to save the city from the advancing Parthians, only to encounter messengers from the Syrian governor Bibulus, telling him that the invaders were in fact a bunch of marauding Arabs dressed up as Parthians to intimidate the peasants. Cursing, Cicero withdraws his troops, only to find out from a certain Diotarus of Galatia, whose son was to marry the daughter of Artavisdes of Armenia, that the Parthians are, in fact, invading. Turns out that Bibulus deliberately downplayed the Parthian threat to set Cicero up and to make him look incompetent. Cicero's relations with Bibulus were notoriously bad. Besides, the man wanted all the glory to himself. At that point, Cicero doesn't know what to believe anymore. Eventually, he learns that the Parthians did invade, but they didn't get very far. They're still in Syria, and again, he learns that from a client prince who tells him that the Parthians are planning a major invasion next summer. But guess what? By next summer, Cicero's commission in Cilicia is over. What we have is a picture of utter confusion, greatly at the mercy of native princes and their political leanings, personal relations with other Roman officials, and rumor. There is no standing system of intelligence gathering whatsoever. Cicero, of course, was not a great general, as he himself admitted, but the difference between Cicero's approach and that of Caesar in Gaul can be expressed more in terms of character and ambition than of methods of sophistication. Naturally, the Senate in Rome could only receive a confused, incomplete, and out-of-date impression of the situation in the provinces, and an even less clear understanding of what was happening beyond, since the governors on the spot had difficulties obtaining information themselves. The Roman senators who acted as diplomats were never specialized in Hellenic or Gallic affairs, nor devised the commitment to an Eastern or Western policy. And in general, I gotta say, overall, the Romans had a certain aversion to professionalism as such. And that held also true for the sphere of diplomacy. The Senate was proud of its corporate identity.
Can you maybe say just a little bit more about that? Because that's just really fascinating.
Yeah, that was a strong statement.
I'm sure I'm not the only one. Like, what do you mean? Like, so people got, it was faux pas to be on a certain job for a longer period of time, or
of course.
So why and how?
Because you have to work for your
this?
money. You're breaking your back because you won't eat otherwise.
But you said they had an aversion to professionalism.
Yes, a proper gentleman has enough money to dabble in a little bit of everything.
Yeah, words I live by.
The original Renaissance man, he does a bit of poetry, a bit of warfare, a bit of gymnastics, a bit of art, a bit of this and that. But like being a specialist, like, come on now. What are you, a shoemaker? Um, this is actually a much bigger subject because it all ties into the ownership of the land. They felt that only income that comes from land, i.e. passive income, rent, is the real income. The senatorial class was forbidden to practice commerce. Of course, they did through their freedmen, through like second parties, but in principle, you are not supposed to even think about having to make money. It makes you a base individual by default.
I love it.
So this approach, or it's sort of trickled down into the diplomatic sphere among all the other spheres as well. They weren't specialists, and they were rather proud of their corporate status. And also, they were super jealous of each other. It was like families fighting for honor, for individual accomplishments, which does not exactly develop a corps of experts. So, rounding up with the Republic, we can make a little pause there because things get very, very different with the Empire. It's pretty clear that the Republican intelligence apparatus was insufficient, to say the least, especially for dealing with the threats that were coming up from around the bend, such as the Parthian Empire and the big barbarian confederations along the Danube and Rhine frontier. Ultimately, it was only the efficiency and fighting superiority of the Romans which made conquests possible. And while a Caesar might get away with invading Britain in complete ignorance of what he might face, Crassus might allow himself to be led blindly into disaster, such as what happened at Carra. Rome groped its way to the empire, and it was ignorance, not knowledge of the world, which it tried to conquer, that was most characteristic of the empire, of the Republic, I'm sorry. And the empire, things became drastically different. It was 108% turn, but here I think we should make a little pause, and I will be happy to take questions and drink another cup of tea and let my mouth cool down a bit.
That sounds like a good plan. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask right away?
I guess
Nobody has-
I have a question. Was it common for, like, elected senators to not have any military experience, or was it kind of like more or less a prerequisite?
It was a prerequisite because they didn't really distinguish between service in the army and service to the state. It was one and the same. They didn't have professional militaries until the Marian reform. The legionnaires were peasants. The equestrians were the cavalry, and the senatorial class were the officers. So if you didn't have military service in your background, you couldn't advance up the cursus honorum. It was your first initial stepping block. I'm sure there have been exceptions. There must have, but few and far between, and probably people had to deal with accusations of cowardice for the rest of their lives. The only person who comes to mind, to be honest, is Cicero. And even at that, Cicero was not a Roman aristocrat.
But he did, later on.
He didn't have proper army experience, but then he didn't come from Rome. He came from some boondocks in central Italy. He was a new man. And so, serving in the army, this really changed later because like by 4th century AD, service in the army was something you want to avoid if you can, which is one of the reasons for barbarization of the army. Only barbarians were willingly taking up these jobs. But in the Republican time, the army service was a privilege. You couldn't fight if you couldn't afford your own equipment, which is the reason for Marian reforms. All these constant wars would take peasants away from their homes for years and years and years. Meanwhile, their farms would run into the ground, they come back, they're impoverished, and they can no longer afford their own equipment. And that was a tragedy, because every Roman fighter, be it a light footman or a legionary or a horseman, provided his own equipment himself, and they fought for the privilege. So no, without army experience during the Republic, and I would say during the first 150 maybe years of the Principate, you're not going anywhere. Just like the United States, right?
Yeah, so when it came to generals, they were probably pretty professional in what they were doing. Like you couldn't have, I mean, you had to work your way up, right?
Yes and no. Offshoots of famous, powerful families got to be pretty high up the command structure from the outset, even if they joined the Legion as a snot-nosed 16-year-old. But the competition between these families was such that without having a certain level of intelligence and initiative, you would simply never advance far enough to get your like Rathfraun, to get your Triumph, to get your Honoras. And so as a result, you would not be eligible to run for Questor or for Aedile, because that was the whole idea. Like, I make my name in a certain battle, in a certain campaign, I come back, people recognize me, they love me, I buy them some beers, I make some games, then I run for an office and they all know me and they will vote for me. And eventually I will bring honor to the family. Also, of course, the Roman army, because it fought all the time, there was the official table of ranking and the unofficial table of ranking. In other words, the primus pilus, the senior centurion of the legion, who came up from the soldiers, his word actually weighed more than the word of a white band tribune, who is supposedly a second in command of the whole legion. So they had ways to really counteract these noble pups from running the units into the ground.
So maybe you'll get to this part later, but like you were talking about, you know, kind of Secret Service espionage that was going on in Rome.
Well, the Secret Service espionage started under the Empire because they finally got professional about their shit, and this is what we're about to get into.
Awesome.
So if you guys don't mind, I'll proceed. So, Empire. This here is the memorial to one Tiberius Claudius Maximus at Philippi, which records that this man, who had a distinguished career in the cavalry of Legion 7 Claudii in Maesia, was selected by the Emperor Trajan as an explorator for the Second Dacian War. That war took place in the early 2nd century AD. The emperor was presumably impressed by the courage and the wits which had gained Maximinus decorations in the preceding Dacian War. Maximinus became the leader of a squadron of exploratores that operated so recklessly deep behind enemy lines that they managed to corner and capture the Dacian king Decebalus, bringing his head to the emperor. The incident is illustrated not only on just funerary stele, but also on Trajan's triumphal column, which commemorates Roman victory in Dacian War. Here is a detail of the frieze. Can you guys see it? That's King Decebalus on the ground. Here is Maximinus reaching up to him. Note the similarity between the sculptural depiction, right? So a detail from the frieze, a figure which we can now identify as Maximus surrounded by a body of horsemen, all of them note bearing shields of different blazons, catching up to the Dacian king, who is now on his knees about to commit suicide. It has been argued that the designer of the frieze had intended this shield detail to indicate a special force drawn from several different ala, a commandos unit basically. We know that the Romans of the empire used temporary assignments to create quick reaction groups, drawing on the best from different units and stations for especially important missions. With the establishment of the Principate, what changed? The pace of Roman expansion slowed down. The creation of stable borders and the permanent provincial bureaucracy allowed intelligence cycles to become far more regular and efficient than they had ever been under the Republic. Border outposts, bridges, and forts were now permanently staffed, becoming intelligence gathering and dissemination centers. The information was passed along for strategic analysis to their respective provincial centers, which became hubs of political and military intelligence. Here is an example of one such report, one among hundreds and thousands that trickled in from the border outposts on a daily basis. Nenu Britonis, nimium multi equis, gladis non utuntur equitis, nec residunt Britunculi iat Iaculos mitant, which means the Britons are nude. There are very many horsemen. The horsemen do not have swords, but the nasty little Britons do not stop in order to throw their javelins. This message comes from Vindolanda, a fort that is part of Hadrian's Wall defensive limes in Scotland. The Romans also set out to acquire geographical information in anticipation of major wars that were yet to come. Aelius Gallus, prefect of Egypt from 27 to 25 BC, rode with an army to Arabia, and the elder Pliny notes specifically that he recorded useful information about the tribal and agricultural infrastructure of the region. His successor, Caius Petronius, made a similar foray into Ethiopia, penetrating some 1,400 kilometers from Aswan up the Nile, and sometime in Augustus's reign, an exploration of the Baltic area took place. Only with the advent of the rule of one man did this kind of intelligence undertaking become viable. And of course, the Romans reformed their intelligence gathering as well. Exploratores, such as our friend Maximus, were initially scouts and reconnaissance element of the Roman army. They're already mentioned in Caesar's writing. Exploratores were tasked to keep watch on enemy movement in the field. They were chosen specifically for their wits and their knowledge of the languages, and were recruited from the best riders in the cavalry, usually decorated. The typical soldier assigned to this unit would generally be native to the area, which meant knowledge of the terrain. In fact, some historians have argued that units of exploratores were originally raised from Rhine-based legions as spearhead troops in imperial campaigns, and indeed the concentration of exploratores units is unique to Upper Germany. No other province can show a similar distribution along the full length of its frontier. The evidence is consistent with our seeing their appearance as part of the long-term reaction to the pressure of the barbarians on the Rhine. According to Vegetius, a commander chose exploratores personally from the most proven cavalry troops, and they formed a special subunit within each legion. They most likely had their own special equipment, their own commando gadgets, though we only know of one such item for sure because of a chance remark by Pliny the Younger, who calls it necessary for exploratores to have a special type of flintstone used to strike fire clandestinely and quickly. Besides strategic recon, the exploratores could penetrate in depth and capture or execute enemy leaders, such as cornering the Kibaluts. According to Dio Cassius, Maximus and his men intercepted the king's party in a mountainous location and destroyed his bodyguards. After the last of his bodyguards fell, the king escaped alone to a rocky place, where he was apparently reached by a Roman trooper who had dismounted and was leading his horse on foot, since the terrain was too steep or too rough to hide. Apparently, before Maximus could reach him, Decebalus committed suicide by cutting his own throat, thus making himself unavailable for a triumph in Rome, since the traditional format would have the defeated enemy leader dragged in chains before the triumphator's chariot, so the troopers were likely under orders to capture Decebalus alive if possible. But what Maximus accomplished was definitely good enough for the government work, as they say. For even more sensitive missions, the Romans of the empire had a different group of agents called speculatores. More often than not, these were drawn from the ranks of former exploratores, but the speculatores did not serve as regular scouts. They were spies. Caesar mentioned speculatores twice in his commentary, but it was under Augustus when the speculatores really were formalized into a special service, when each legion incorporated its own subunit of 10 speculatores who acted as collectors and keepers of strategic intelligence. While exploratores were sent out in strength on specific missions to locate the enemy and report on its actions, the speculatores worked in small numbers, sometimes in pairs or even alone, on clandestine missions that demanded special trust. Unlike the exploratores, speculatores usually gathered information working in disguise. While both exploratores and speculatores collected information about the hostiles, only speculatores were ever referred to as spies in plain clothes, occulta speculatrix in Latin.
Wait,
In
sorry.
short,
This
Huh?
caption, is that yours or is this the?
no, this is my girlfriend's.
Good one.
So, occulta speculatrix, people who might be able to infiltrate enemy towns and positions while doing so undetected by posing as deserters, refugees, merchants, and so on. But the speculatores had other uses too, the most important of which was running the cursus publicus. So what was cursus publicus? It was a state postal and messenger service which revamped the inadequate republican system of private messengers. With the advent of the empire, a whole new system had to be put in place for communication between provinces and Rome. Augustus first established a relay of messengers to pass information from city to city. This method was an improvement on the republican practice and afforded greater speed, but it had one major disadvantage. The courier on the last leg of the relay had no knowledge of the message's originating context. So Augustus modified the system again and stationed post carriages and animals at each relay point, rather than changing messengers at each station. So now each messenger traveled along the whole route. This was cursus publicus. It had both reliability and speed. As the system developed, the couriers were, surprise, drawn increasingly from the army, and in particular, surprise, from the exploratores. We have proof of that. For instance, a gray stone from the 2nd century AD, now in Belgrade, shows a speculator in a postal carriage bearing the insignia of his office. So this here is what the speculatore insignia looked like. Actually, I'm lying to you. This is the insignia of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA from the 1940s. In reality, the insignia of speculatores looked like this. This is the badge of the Roman security agent. And this here, again, is the badge of an OSS agent. No connection whatsoever, right? Anyway, according to Procopius, by the time of Justinian, the messengers could travel at tremendous speed, covering up to 200 Roman miles per day. That's 300 kilometers. And they traveled a lot. As Libanius has described an agent that he often traversed the world on horseback. By furnishing a network of transport and communication, Augustus built the backbone of what later became the Imperial Security Service. And now we get to the dirty part. The prototype of a dirty Roman Secret Service had begun to emerge during the Civil War. The warring factions turned to trusted soldiers in their private military retinues who ferreted out information and did all the other dirty work of the secret police. Augustus was fully acquainted with the use of trusted personnel on missions of this kind. On many occasions, he had troublemakers eliminated in such a way that it could never be known what became of them. When Octavian suspected Mark Antony of undermining his popularity with the Roman people, he went into action, and I'm quoting from Appian. Octavian, thus at last openly attacked, sent numerous agents to towns colonized by his father, that is Julius Caesar, to tell how he had been treated and to learn the state of feelings in each. He also sent certain persons in the guise of traitors into Antony's camp to mingle with the soldiers, to work upon the boldest of them and secretly distribute handbills among the rank and file. Naturally, speculatores were the people best suited for that kind of clandestine work that rooted out internal dissent. They also served as the emperor's bodyguards. Claudius was accustomed to having a few speculatores standing by when he attended dinner parties. But their use was not limited to the emperor. One famous example of a speculator employed as a courier comes from the Gospel of Mark. Herod sent a speculator to the prison with an order to execute John the Baptist. Because Augustus was so broadly popular, he did not need large-scale internal spying operations, and the speculatores never lost their primary intelligence function. In the later empire, though, we can see them working on Rome's borders, running their own communication networks, signaling vital information to the backlines, independent of any regular legionary signal network. But it is from the speculatores that the infamous frumentarii originate. And it's the frumentarii that really put military and political intelligence of the empire onto a totally different level compared to even what Augustus had available to him. So the frumentarii. Originally, frumentarii were the food supply officers in the Roman army. They were the collectors of wheat, frumentum. Frumentarius is a Latin adjective meaning grain merchant or pertaining to grains. The frumentarii knew the terrain and they spoke the many languages of the empire. So, when in mid-2nd century AD, the Emperor Hadrian decided that he needs a dedicated apparatus to serve as his eyes and ears, it is not surprising that he turned to the military logistics professionals. They were already in contact not only with other officers, but also with suppliers, local officials, farmers, merchants. They had a latticework of relationships, and they had their military discipline, and that made them ideal candidates for the job. Hadrian just expanded their duties beyond searching for wheat. The headquarters of the frumentarii were located at Castra Peregrina, literally Camp of the Strangers, on Caelian Hill in Rome. But their work took them all over the empire. They were used as couriers, spies, tax collectors, and police. There are a number of inscriptions honoring the genii of Castra Peregrina, which suggests that the frumentarii had high moral and social status. Their distinctive landscape design, the badge of office, frequently featured in their belt fittings, brooches, and other personal equipment. When they were in Rome, the frumentarii formed a regularly organized unit, the numerus frumenturiorum, and were subject to their own commanding centurion. To stand out from the other troops, the centurion had the title of princeps peregrinorum, or commander of the strangers, or commander of the foreigners, depending on how you translate it. The following story from Historia Augusta has been used as evidence for the role of the frumentarii. Hadrian's vigilance was not confined to his own household. but extended to those of his friends. And by means of his private agents, the frumentarios, he even pried into all their secrets, and so skillfully that they were never aware that the emperor was acquainted with their private lives until he revealed it himself. In this connection, the insertion of an incident will not be unwelcome, showing that he found out much about his friends. The wife of a certain man wrote to her husband, complaining that he was so preoccupied by pleasures and baths that he would not return home to her, and Hadrian found this out through his private agents. And so, when the husband asked for a furlough, Hadrian approached him with his fondness for his baths and his pleasures, whereupon the man exclaimed, "Why, has my wife sent you a letter as well?" Despite their versatility, for the most part, the speculatores busied themselves with the military intelligence, something akin to Russian GRU or the German Abwehr. But the emphasis of the frumentarii work was internal. Their job was sniffing out corruption, dissent, and treason. So it's not surprising that the frumentarii eventually became a hated presence in the provinces of Rome. In fact, the unpopularity of the organization grew to such an extent that the Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305, had the frumentarii disbanded. This is not to say that he gave up on the centralized form of intelligence gathering. On the contrary, Diocletian created the agentes in rebus, translated something to akin as general agents. These agents were a bigger and better iteration of the frumentarii, but had a few different key characteristics. Unlike their predecessors, who remained a part of the military, the agentes in rebus were deemed to be civilians. The agents did not respond to a military leader, but answered instead to an interesting official known as the Master of Offices, essentially the Roman Minister of Information, who presided over the emperor's inner council, the consistorium. The agentes in rebus expanded on the work done previously by the frumentarii, as well as working the usual jobs, such as fulfilling the roles of couriers, spies, tax collectors, and clandestine enforcers. The agents also worked as supervisors on sensitive construction projects, and even as ambassadors. But overall, the Roman leadership focused this professional intelligence organization mainly on their own population rather than on foreign threats. Generals and military leaders on the frontiers kept their own personal scouts and speculatores to gain information about the enemy. Agentes in rebus, however, seem to have been primarily directed at searching for dissent in the empire and uncovering internal and international conspiracies. So, to give you an idea about the scope of these general agents, I'll provide a few quick examples. During the reign of Constantius II, an agens called Apodemius was sent to deliver a message to call back Silvanus, a distinguished general, for questioning on the charge of treason. Instead of simply delivering the order, Apodemius decided to investigate the case himself. He started out by imprisoning and interrogating Silvanus's friends and relatives, which finally did force Silvanus into open rebellion. Who would have thought? This case is one of many that demonstrate the notoriety of the agents. It is intriguing that Apodemius dared to disobey the imperial order and thought that he could act without reprisal in the domain of Silvanus, the Magister Militum of Gaul. The incident also illustrates that the agentes were no ordinary messengers, and that they were perfectly capable of conducting a forceful investigation involving imprisoning and interrogation, either by receiving an imperial prerogative or by exceeding their authority. It is clear, nonetheless, that the imperial administration was wary of this tendency, since two different edicts were enacted to specifically prohibit and warn against exceeding the given authority. Ammianus Marcellinus also mentions the involvement of an agens in assassination. Quote, "When this was reported to the emperor, his anger and indignation became inexorable. He saw that his only means of ensuring his own safety lay in the destruction of Gallus. So he sent Cyrenian, who, as I have already said, had escaped a charge of treason by a sort of sleight of hand, together with Pentadius the notary and Apodemius the security agent, with orders to carry the execution. And this is exactly the sort of shit that the Romans of the Republic were worried about. Guess they had a point after all. But it wasn't just the domestic duties. Special agents had a heavy presence in foreign affairs. They were widely employed as envoys. During the reign of Honorius, an agent was sent to negotiate a peace treaty with the Visigoths, and he escorted Placidia, the emperor's captive sister, back home. In 530, an agent was sent as an ambassador to Ethiopia. In 540, to a Persian king, and in 686 to Abd al-Malik, the fifth Umayyad caliph. The Old and New books of Tang also mention several embassies made by Fulin, which is how the Chinese refer to the Eastern Roman Empire. And agents also appears in Peter Diaconus's Liber de Locis Sanctis, which depicts an agents as an official who was stationed at Clysma and led yearly expeditions to India. Libanus also has an interesting story about an agents called Climatius, who, after delivering orders to Antioch in 355, was used by the Praetorian prefect of the East, Strategius, to leave the empire and go into the Persian territory to report on troop movements. While agentes in rebus reported to master of offices, as opposed to the army, they stayed in close contact with the military. We know of an edict which prohibited anyone from demanding supplementary horses from the cursus, except for the agentes on a mission to move soldiery. Agentes routinely accompanied military expeditions. For instance, we know of an agents who traveled back from the Persian Empire to deliver a battle report to Emperor Theodosius at Constantinople. And of course, they acted as informers. Ammianus tells of agentes eavesdropping on such things as dinner talk and reporting back to their superiors. Symmachus recounts an agents bringing accusations against a senator. There are many such instances. So in essence, they acted as internal security network for the emperor. Their primary role was with the cursus publicus, which gave them access to vast amounts of information. However, they were not above the cloak and dagger techniques. So the reorganization of the intelligence apparatus of the empire was phenomenally successful overall. To illustrate the pervasiveness of intelligence activities in the later empire, I will briefly mention several incidents that all took place in the span of a single year. In early 359, the Caesar Julian, also known as Julian the Apostate, sent a speculator named Hariabodis, a reliable officer thoroughly acquainted with the local dialects, across the Rhine to negotiate with the previously subdued Alemannic king Hartarius. The intention was that Hariabodis would then move on to frontiers of the still hostile kings and use his knowledge of their language to discover what they were plotting. At the same time, Julian's co-emperor Constantius II sent two tribunes, both accompanied by interpreters, across the Danube to question the Sarmatians about the reason for breaking the peace treaty established the year before. A few months later, Julian Speculatorus intercepted a letter carried by a secretary of the Alemannic chieftain Vadamarius, which revealed that Vadamarius was employed to keep watch on Julian, and the later consequently issued secret orders to his agents to have Vadamarius arrested. I should point out that at the time, the emperors no longer sat at Rome. They were always on the move. And so, when Julian amused himself with the Germans in the West, his co-ruler Constantius II moved east. At Antioch, Constantius was briefed by his frontier commanders. Apparently, the Persians, led by Shahanshah Sapor, were approaching the Tigris. This prompted Constantius, that's Sapor right there, prompted Constantius to collect his own forces, cross the Euphrates, and advance to Edessa. There he awaited reports from the Speculatores. When these reports turned out to be contradictory, Constantius ordered the two commanders of his field army, magistri militum praesentalis arbitio and agiolo, to carry on to the Tigris and keep watch for where Sapor would cross. Scouts and deserters continued to bring conflicting accounts of Persian intentions, and the emperor's consistorium judged this to reflect a general lack of hard plan among the Persians. Constantius returned west to address trouble in Illyricum. En route, he was overtaken by messengers from the east who validated the decision of the consistorium. Sapor had made with unfavorable circumstances and withdrawn from the Roman borders. These are just the big events reported by just one historian, Ammianus Marcellinus. Pretty fat for the scope of 1 year, isn't it? The historian Marcellinus, by the way, himself was no stranger to the workings of the intelligence apparatus. He served in the East as the imperial guardsman, protector domesticus. In 359, historian Ammianus Marcellinus himself undertook a dangerous espionage assignment that contributed eyewitness information concerning that year's confrontation with the Persians. As part of his account, Marcellinus describes an encrypted report sent back to the command headquarters of his chief Ursicinus at Amida. The dispatch came on a parchment hidden in a sword scabbard, smuggled back from a high-level diplomatic team that was negotiating with the Persians at Ctesiphon. The message was sent by the imperial secretary Procopius, who had accompanied the Roman ambassador disguised as one of his servants. In the course of his undercover mission, Procopius had discovered that the apparitor Antonius, a Syrian with a grievance against various influential Romans, had collected a host of information on military dispositions in the East and had defected to Persia. Then Antoninus had been successful in persuading Sapor to invade Syria. The cryptogram Obscuris Indicantem was deciphered with great difficulty because, according to Marcellinus, it was written in code, Notarum Figuris. The message indicated that Shahanshah Sapor, urged on by Antoninus, would invade Syria, crossing the rivers Anzaba and Tigris. Thus, it gave an idea of the route the Persians were to follow. Their very large numbers, which indicated the force levels that were necessary to be held for defense, and most importantly, how much of Roman defense information was already in Persian hands. The Persians were a very formidable enemy. The defection of a former senior functionary made the situation crucial. At this point, in his headquarters in Amida, Ursicinus responded by dispatching Ammianus Marcellinus on an espionage mission deep into Persian territory. The future historian went on to the high country overlooking the two indicated rivers to assess more exactly the size and speed of the invasion. Marcellinus's report to Ursicinus on his return caused a range of defensive responses set in motion. On that particular occasion, the preparations turned out to be not particularly useful, since unseasonable flooding of the Euphrates forced the thrust of the Persian invasion further north and brought about the lengthy siege of Amida. In the later stages of the Persian invasion, Marcellinus had captured a Roman deserter himself. The man was originally from Gaul, and he turned out to have been working as a spy for the Persians in the Roman frontier zone and admitted to having sent back frequent reports under interrogation. Here, it should be noted that the Romans kept their own undercover speculatores on the Persian territory. How long their secret missions lasted, we don't know, but we're definitely talking years, if not decades. They were the original sleeper cells. We also know that they sent back letters written in vinegar, milk, and urine, which is where the expression writing between the lines originates. The secret part of the message appears when the papyrus is heated. Border communications became pretty sophisticated too. Polybius discusses at some length a signaling system which he himself took part in developing. That one involved the use of torches held at different positions to denote letters of the alphabet, apparently a kind of fire-based semaphore arrangement. Appian discusses the use of fire and smoke as signaling devices. Vegetius goes on to great length discussing how they should be used. On the line of frontier in Britain and in the German limes, in Palestine and in Tripolitania, as well as some seaboards, such as Yorkshire coast, numerous watchtowers had been used. They were traced and linked to systems of communications. Their protruding torches are depicted on Trajan's and Marcus Aurelius's columns, along with the square piles of logs and straw ricks. So this is basically the overall picture of intelligence in the later Roman Empire. And I think I'm going to wrap this up at this point on a low note on the Battle of Adrianople. Their political and military intelligence has really advanced eons since the inception of the Principate. But good intelligence is only part of the equation. It's not a panacea against disaster. The annals of the later Roman Empire are scarred by events that took place on the afternoon of 9th August 378. In a great battle, a Roman field army was defeated near Adrianople in Thrace. An emperor died on the battlefield with tens of thousands of irreplaceable men. The battle heralded the beginning of the Western Empire's collapse, as it lost its ability to resist external pressure. The day before, Emperor Valens had received a report from his exploratores, who had been carrying out an armed reconnaissance sweep beyond Adrianople. The large Gothic force encamped there now consisted of only 10,000 Visigothic infantry, and that meant the powerful Ostrogothic cavalry was elsewhere, collecting food and plunder. Valens seized on this information and moved to Adrianople, aiming to deliver a decisive blow. During the night, he called a meeting with his consistorium. Council was split. The more cautious group, headed by Magister Victor, recommended that Valens postpone the attack, giving the Western Emperor Gratian time to arrive with the units to consolidate the Roman strength. Then they would move as a combined force to fight a safer battle. The Western forces were not far away. Already communication between the two armies had been established. The other group of officers urged immediate action. They were led by a general who knew what he was doing. Sebastianus had been appointed to overall command in the region about 2 months prior and was immensely successful. He had adopted an aggressive, guerrilla-style mode of campaigning, recovering large amounts of plunder and numerous prisoners. The methods Sebastianus had employed had forced the Goths to cease raiding in small bands and to coalesce into bigger groups for their own protection. This way, they were vulnerable to large-scale Roman attack. Valens's need for decisive battle must be seen in its context. Relations between the Romans and the Goths have been deteriorating ever since the Visigoths had been allowed to cross the lower Danube 3 years prior, in 375. The Ostrogoths and some other less old tribes had been denied permission to enter the empire, but they crossed over anyway, taking advantage of the fact that the administration had been busy resettling the Visigoths. The influx of the migrants, the reception accorded them, and their response to abuses to which they were subjected over the following 2 years had created chaos all over the region. Increasingly senior and experienced military men had been assigned to deal with the problem that kept on escalating. As the situation unfolded, the response of the Roman intelligence services was efficient and professional. The Roman leadership relied on timely reports during a campaign in northern Thrace in 377, and thus avoided being trapped by a large Gothic force. On another occasion, Gothic attempts to cut essential supply lines immediately before Valens's march to Adrianople were thwarted. There are many more such examples. The intelligence side of the campaign was not marred by errors of information. But the emperor had a bigger problem. He was not popular at home. Valens was jealous of Sebastianus reporting his successes, and he was needled by reports from the West, announcing his nephew Gratian victorious against the Germans. Valens pined for a victory all of his own. and he did not want to share credit. And so, the meeting of the emperor's consistorium achieved nothing. His mind was already made up. Caught between Gratian's ascendancy and the grumbling in the capital, Valens knew the disposition of his immediate enemy, and as his troops moved 12 kilometers from Adrianople, exploratores working ahead of the army reported no changes in the number of soldiers where they had initially spotted the large formation of the Goths' wagons. 10,000 Visigoths Valens could handle on his own. Victory was in his grasp. Indeed, if the attack planned by Valens had gone ahead at the time the decision was made, it is likely that his force would have put the Gothic infantry out of action before the Ostrogothic cavalry was able to return. But then the emperor hesitated. Time was wasted on last-minute negotiations with the Gothic chieftain Fritigern on 3 separate occasions in the 15 hours before the battle. We must assume that Valens was willing to enter negotiations at this very last moment in the hope of finding a solution to the problem by incorporating the Goths into the empire without loss to Roman manpower, a practice he had adopted before. In fact, the stalling provided the Goths with a vital few hours needed to get the Ostrogothic cavalry back to the scene and to shift the balance in their favor at the very last moment. It also distracted the emperor and his staff from devoting their full attention to the oncoming battle. Delays, once recognized as such, could have nudged the emperor to decisive action. The reports he had been receiving were accurate. Why else should Fritigern have been so desperate to put off the start of the battle? In the morning, with the Ostrogothic cavalry still some ways off, the case for striking would have been overwhelming. Valens did finally strike, but it was just too late. The mistake rests with the emperor's hesitation, not with the intelligence that was available to him. The Roman cavalry was hit in the rear by returning Ostrogoths and driven off the battlefield. Abandoned, the Roman infantry was surrounded and cut to pieces. An apocryphal account states that Valens wore no helmet in order to encourage his men as he led the final charge, which turned the tide of the battle for a time until the emperor was struck in the face by a Gothic dart. He was carried off the battlefield to a small wooden hut. The hut was surrounded by the Goths, who put it to the torch, evidently unaware of the prize within. Valens burned. 2/3 of the army lay dead when the battle was over. Many of the best officers had also perished. What was left of the Roman force was led from the field under the cover of night by Magister Victor. The Goths were unable to breach the walls of Adrianople itself and eventually retreated for more looting. The disaster at Adrianople had very serious long-term effects, but it cannot be ascribed to an intelligence failure. Intelligence collection had functioned in a normal and detailed way right up to the battle. The fault lay with the individuals concerned. They simply did not ask the right questions about the information they already possessed. What went wrong was the human factor, not the system. Still, the Roman intelligence has come a long way from the days of Cicero's lost Cilician cohorts and divination on chicken livers. And the system survived for another millennia in the Eastern Roman Empire, the state we rather inappropriately refer to as Byzantium. But the Eastern Empire is the subject for another day, and I thank you for keeping me company.
Amazing. Thank you. This was really great. Although personally, I like chicken livers. I don't know what was wrong with them, but you know.
It's more about Cicero than chicken livers.
So bad. No, but
Do you guys, are you guys alive enough, awake enough to ask me anything? I'd be happy to clear things up if I mumbled over something.
Mish, can I ask something? So
Okay.
you talked about sort of spies that were kind of hobos hanging out in different places trying to scrape some information. But did they have like embedded spies in places of power, like sort of amongst the Persian elite, for example, or something like this?
It's a really good question. So it's actually a really, really, really good question, because the Persians had an incredible security system of their own. There was no fucking with the Persians. I don't know much about them, but most of what I know about them comes from the Romans themselves, and the Romans had the Persian security and intelligence in the utmost high regard. However, on the other side, in the West, Northwest, yes, absolutely. Which brings back the whole story of Teutoburg Forest, if you guys know this story, because the legions, Varus's legions that were destroyed by Arminius, Varus knew all about Arminius's rebellion, because Sigetius, the other German chieftain, has been telling him all along. And moreover, Arminius, the reason things went so out of hand was that Arminius was exactly the person you're asking about. Arminius was the Roman who was among the Germans pretending to be a German, who then decided that actually he likes being a German better and like kind of switch sides. But yes, they managed to fool the barbarians. They couldn't fool the Persians.
Cool.
Yeah, Misha, I want to make sure you're seeing all the comments because a lot of people are just saying thank you in the comment box.
Where?
In the chat box, can you see that?
Well, no, I can't, but they can turn on their microphones and talk to me if they care. Chat. Yes. There was a lot of comments. Well, thank you.
Misha, while you
Thank you, guys.
revel in those, I want to follow up on something that you mentioned. You mentioned contact between Eastern Roman Empire and China.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I've always kind of heard vague references to the fact that at its outermost expanse and sort of, you know, as the outer edge of what Romans were capable of was somehow some level of contact with China, right? With some so like just how much do we know like about it? How much contact was there, and what was, you know, what was there like a symmetrical record in Chinese historiography? And
So there was almost never any direct contact.
okay.
The one time they apparently have had direct contact is Chinese sources traveling very, very, very far west. I can't remember which emperor it was. Basically, after Crassus lost at Carra, the Parthians took 10,000 or so Romans prisoner,
Okay.
and they decided not to waste these good, able-bodied men who know how to fight, but rather resettle them on their own eastern frontier to cover from their own eastern barbarians.
Okay.
And the Chinese who got there about 10 years later wrote in their sources of very strangely armed, pale men who fought in testudo formation, which is a classic Roman formation, the legionary turtle. So that, as far as I know, is the only time that the Chinese and the Romans actually came into contact directly.
So we're talking Crassus, like the Spartacus Crassus, so like the second century. Okay.
Yep. So
Cool.
it's like late 1st century BC.
Late first century. You mean late 2nd century BC, right?
First.
Late first would be like the
Crassus is like 53 BC,
Oh, okay. All right. Got it. Thank you. Okay, cool. So
give or take.
thanks. That's very interesting. Thank you.
That being said, the Eastern Romans were a lot better at diplomacy, and they were more curious about the world to a certain extent, and then the world was older, thus becoming smaller. So as far as Eastern Roman Empire goes, and I mean like 7th, 8th, 9th centuries,
Mhm.
they dealt with the Chinese all the time. They stole silk from the Chinese. Constantinople was the only producer of silk in Europe because agents, were worth their salt. The Chinese.
These are Romans, right? These are like people who call themselves Romans, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, they called themselves Roman. Their
Right.
political structure was Roman.
Right.
But this is a bigger beast. I worry that now I'll be torn alive by people who think that Byzantium isn't Rome, which I disagree with. But yes, it's the other Rome.
There's not a lot of lingering emotions about this subject, Misha. That's just...
Well, some people never sit down to dinner without having a toast to Constantinople. But
Who
yeah,
are those people?
you got one right here. But the Chinese proper, the Han Chinese, they did send envoys to like Rome proper, like Rome. I think at least twice they received messengers from China, but like the original Roman envoys never got to Beijing or Yoyang.
Cool, thanks.
So I finally enough also had a question about the Chinese, because since you were talking about how the Romans despised professionalism, and whereas it seems
Getty, is that
perhaps
you?
my yes.
I can't see you, man. Like I have to. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Maybe I'll stop. Goddamn, Moto. Hey, good background.
So as I was saying, okay, maybe this is an oversimplification, but if we think about Chinese, we're more, or the ancient Chinese civilization, we're thinking about sort of a more bureaucratically minded culture where professionalism, and advancement by merit is held in high regard. And in that light, do you think, I mean, and this is, kind of tangential to your talk, but do we know about the secret services in ancient China? Were they sort of, did they parallel anything
I
that
only know
happened in
about Judge
Roman
Z.
history?
But I have a suspicion that they had everything in its place. I'm sure they I don't know. I'm clueless about China, but I'm pretty sure that they were pretty well set, and they had their secret agents.
Right.
They must have. I think. Look, it's as the society develops, the need of the leukocyte type cells also develops. You need this organization at a certain level of social development, and they were very socially developed, so they must have had it. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about them, but I would die to go to a lecture about them. I really want to know. So if anyone knows, please come forth.
Okay. Conversely, if we go back west, do you see in this evolution of intelligence gathering and secret services in Rome a precursor to, similar agencies in the modern times?
Have you seen their badges of office?
Well, yes, there was that certainly.
No, well,
But
Romans.
I was kind of trying to see if there's an arc to your story that leads up to this, and I'm not sure. I mean, if you really had that in mind or not, or if you can,
I
if you
think
want
that
to comment
all
on that.
things being equal, Romans were handicapped against developing such services because of the Roman peculiar social structure, because of their like society which centered on patronage, meaning it's not so much about the state as much as I'm your client and you're my patron, and I'm loyal to you and you're loyal to me, and I do my duty to you. Fuck Rome, this is you, and you're protecting me. Which is why I think in a society that primarily centers around this, it's difficult to give birth to a class of bureaucrats which serves an idea as opposed to a particular family. If that makes sense.
So
So
you
Yeah,
saying they were only successful because of loyalty to individual people and not to the state at large?
Well, no, they got over it. They got over it, but all things being equal, I think in certain other cultural environs, maybe the secret services may have even developed at an earlier stage, maybe even during the Republic. Like because if you serve a larger good, you know, if you serve the Lord or if you serve the empire, you can pull off stuff that you wouldn't normally pull off if you are just like loyal to particular like people ABC. You can't eavesdrop on them. Like it's Papa, you can't. But if the good Lord he wills,
Yeah, you can justify your actions.
exactly. And the Romans, I mean, by the time Christianity became pervasive enough, that was something. But until then, they really didn't have much. They had the cult of the emperor, which was something, but it wasn't enough to form an ideological bureaucracy.
Why? I mean, like Romans were one of the sort of tribes, right, among the many, many tribes that came to form this very sophisticated empire. Do you have any theories on why they managed to develop this much as opposed to all
Well,
their
the theory is
neighbors?
not mine. It's Eric Gruen's idea. They stumbled into it.
What do you mean?
They stumbled into an empire. Their offices, their structures, their ideas of themselves and the world were completely like, when I say backward, I don't mean it in a bad way. It could be a nice and cuddly way, but they were like simple folks in a way that happened to be located on the Salt Road of Italy, on the Copper Road of Italy. They were between the Greeks and the Etruscans, and they kind of got a little bit from everybody and started growing, and then they became so phenomenally successful so quickly that like in the course of 200 years, like they basically go from the size of town of Olive Bridge, where I reside now, to all of United States. But the mayor of Olive Bridge still has to rule the United States because now Olive Bridge controls all of it. And they're like, so what do we do? Like, and then they started improvising. But they never wanted I mean, they didn't say no to an empire, but they never wanted it. They never set out thinking, we're gonna go to Egypt and have bread, and then we're gonna go to like Syria and have gold, and like start planning. Like there was no build up. There was no long-term strategic approach. They just kind of won a lottery and dealt with it the best they could. Well, why they won a lottery? I guess we can get very reductionist about it and say that yeah, they were on the crossroads and they had a very peculiar like set of values which made them good soldiers, and they had a very peculiar like geographical placement which allowed them to get all these like fancy resources which other people didn't have. They had irons in the hills of Lazio, like they had salt, they had like horses, they had this and that, and it was like a perfect
Yeah.
situation. But I don't think it was their ideology or their like religion or anything like that. I mean, I cut out some of the slides. You should see them. There is like chicken liver slides, like the copper chicken of liver of
Chicken liver.
Piacenza. There is like they try to do auguries on like fake chicken livers. They had metallic ones, you know, for carrying around. Like in case the chicken isn't there, you like throw it. I'm like, all right, like, and then like 200 years they rule Alexandria and Antioch.
Very cool.
They're a funny bunch.
Thank you, Misha. This was highly enjoyable. I'm logging off, but thank you. This was great.
It's good seeing you, man. And I want more of your lectures. Anyone else, guys? I'd be happy to share what I know, and if anyone wants to correct me or to troll or to heckle, I think I've had enough whiskey by now to respond in kind.
Well,
I
maybe
want- I
one more.
wanted to- Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I wanted to say thanks.
it's been a pleasure. I learned a lot researching this too. Some things that weren't clear to me became clear. I want to recommend two books if you guys are interested. There is a wonderful book called Exploratio by Professors Rankov and Austin, which deals mostly with the Imperial Secret Service. And they're phenomenal and they're very funny. And I want to recommend a book by Mary Sheldon, which is called Trust in Gods but Verify. And that book starts out with chicken livers and ends with disaster at Teutoburg. And she's done an insane amount of work on Roman communications. Like we're talking like semaphore signals and relays, and how like from one fort you could see another, and the seaboards of Yorkshire could like instantly pass the signal to North Germany to go. She has dug up an impressive amount of work, and it's a very good read as well. And on a more prosaic note, I want to recommend a TV show called Barbarians, if you guys haven't heard, which is about the Teutoburg forest, the 3 Roman legions being destroyed by German rebels. And it's very cool because for the first time, a piece of narrative fiction is transmitted to us through the eyes of Germans and not through the eyes of Romans, which makes it very different and very cool. And they could fall into 1,000 pitfalls, making themselves lame in the process, but they didn't. And most importantly, Germans speak German and Romans speak Latin. There is no English in that show.
What?
Yeah. And I mean, like literally when the German enters a Roman tent, when he starts speaking German and the scribe starts answering in Latin, you get some English subtitles, like the way a Roman commander would if a German was speaking in his tent. It's a German show. It's very cool. Well, and then finally, there is my own book, which is coming out sometime soon, hopefully. Which
Yes, tell us about that.
well, I'm still writing it. The book is about an agent. It takes place it's in ancient Rome.
Yeah.
And the protagonist is one of those speculatores, one of these agents and rebels who are sent to the remote northeast of the empire to investigate a series of strange deaths and disappearances against a backdrop of a starting pandemic. And then it deteriorates into the usual good adventure, old stuff, poisonings, anal sex, exhumations, the usual. Yeah, it should be something, there'll be something for everyone.
Amazing. Do you know when you plan to be done with it?
This year, hopefully.
Sweet. Let us know once it's ready to be published and we can put in some advanced orders.
Awesome. I would love nothing better myself.
I wanted to ask also Misha, superb lecture.
About people who don't sit down to dinner without mentioning Constantinople, I presume.
I'll not even bang this with a response. But this patronage centered, basically I was wondering, since there was this trajectory from utter amateurishness regarding intelligence to actual specialization and professionalization, but I was wondering why they didn't manage to get to a point that they would make a distinction between internal intelligence and external intelligence towards the internal quote-unquote enemy and the external ones. But you think this was due to, I mean, like in modern times, that you have the military intelligence and you have the intelligence focused on the internal
Do we though?
population.
Do
Yeah,
we though?
you know, in theory at least. But do you think this was due to them being this patronage focused society or something else, or just they didn't have time?
Well, it's a good, interesting question, and I don't know. I mean, on the surface level, they did have two different ones. Agens and Rebus responded to Master of Offices, whereas Speculatores responded to their particular general.
Yeah.
Secondly, when Christianity entered, the Roman values became transposed because Christianity, like the way we know it, it's an amalgamation of Jewish stuff and Greco-Roman stuff, right? So the Greco-Roman stuff is the loyalty stuff and the personal relation. And this is like directly out of that environment. Like, so I think as the political structures crumbled, they were able to sublimate this into something else. Christianity is Rome, some people would say. I mean, they're also human, you know, like the accounts of civil war, for instance, are full of like Caesar exposing Pompey's speculatores and Pompey like going after Caesar's speculatores, and they all like roast and interrogate each other and switch sides. So, of course, saying that like the society, that the glue of society was personal loyalty between client and patron, yes, it's true, except that society fell apart on more than one occasion. So that glue only holds you so far. I mean, yes, it was prevalent, but for some reason, the people of Rome came to hate the frumentarii, so much so that Diocletian had to disband them. And I think we all know why. Because who are these people, really? Speaking of that, another very good book called The Lost Ten. And unlike my book, which is an alternative history, The Lost Ten is a real deal. It takes place in the 4th century. And without giving too much away, a group of commandos, frumentarii, are being sent by Magister of Offices deep into Persian territory to rescue a political prisoner who is being held somewhere high in the mountains beyond Caspian Sea. Yada, yada, yada. This is not highbrow literature, but it's incredibly entertaining.
Hi. Can
Hello.
I ask the question to the man upstairs?
Ask and ye shall receive.
um, yeah, Misha is literally upstairs. So I had a question about the idea that you seem to mention about the Republican period, where these military sort of intelligence gathering or this idea of being sneaky was somehow maybe not very Roman. Or, you know, that, who was it that got criticized? Scipio got criticized for being.
Well, that's the idea they broadcasted. That's the idea about themselves that the Romans like to think. Yes.
Okay. So my question is though, do you think that there was some kind of fundamental change between the Republican period and the imperial period in some kind of mindset?
Of course, they were corrupted by the Greeks.
I know that's the question. That's your answer to everything, isn't it?
That's a good question.
But I mean,
though.
you know, do you really think that the Romans were like, you know, kind of learned the lesson from Hannibal, and that was kind of a watershed moment?
It was.
Or on top of that, do you think that there was some kind of, you know, sort of philosophical change in the way the Romans saw themselves and the imperial?
It was both, because yes, they had to learn from Hannibal or they would die. But also Hannibalic wars were the moment where they reached a critical mass. After that, there was no stopping them. Because after being victorious in the Second Punic War, they got everything. And with everything comes a different perspective. So I think you're totally correct to note this, that like these things went hand in hand, and which one was the chicken and which one was the liver, we don't know, but the development would not be possible with only one. So yes, like they had to become worldly to become victorious, but they also needed it for victory. So yeah, it's around that time that it changes. Yes, basically it's a watershed moment. It's like before the Hannibalic Wars, we were people of faith, honesty, you know, scrupulous. We were tough, and now look at us. Look at us now. That sentiment was absolutely pervasive in like the last century of the Republican existence, and they look back at pre-Hannibalic times, like Cincinnatus.
Can I ask another question? So what you described is very much like sort of live networks where people are sort of changing information, but did they have some way of storing knowledge?
Yes.
So like
Yes.
they kept records of techniques, of battles, of things like this?
I wish I could go into that in more detail. It was one of the things that I had to cut because it was too fucking long as it was. So basically, formation of static frontiers leads to formation of static forts and garrisons. And that leads to, very importantly and overlooked, permanent palaces of provincial governors. These were the intelligence centers, because all these hundreds of tiny and not so tiny forts report daily, like to Trier, if it's Upper Germany, or to Aquileia, if it's Raetia. And this is where you have professional bureaucracy sorting useful, not useful, similar, not similar, only with the Principate, obviously. And actually, Rankov's work, which I mentioned, it deals with that, like that little piece that I mentioned about the nasty little Britons. I just took it because it was funny, but he has done an incredible amount of like just sifting through actual sources and then trying to figure out why did he find these sources and not some other sources, and who was sifting through this stuff before him. We don't know a lot about it, but yeah, their cartography was horrific. They just didn't know how to make maps, and they never learned. So that part, not so much. But I mean, they were definitely number crunchers in their own way. And considering the system they used for counting, it's all the more surprising. Like their like elliptical calculations can cause a headache even for people who know what an elliptical calculation is. They did a lot of keeping and bookkeeping and counting and all sorts of records, for sure.
Thanks. Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, Misha. How's it going?
What's
It
up,
was
man? Good to see you.
an amazing talk, and it's been a little while since I saw you in the flesh, but amazing talk that really was binding. And
Thanks, man.
I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how, you know, this is kind of changing the gear, I guess, but like how you have dealt with this huge wealth of research and how you're conceiving to, or how you have conceived about moving this into kind of the realm of, you know, your narrative, and how you approach that problem, because there's so much, you know, there's like a world, like worlds within worlds within worlds that, you know, you've discovered here or you've rediscovered here. And how are you kind of thinking about that?
I just like, it's a very knee-jerk reaction, really. I read a story and I start drooling. Like that letter that Procopius sent from Persians, like in a scabbard, encrypted letter sent to the Romans. I dropped most of the juicy details about it because that letter actually was a metaphor. It was an encrypted metaphor. He was talking about King Darius, making war on the Greeks. Wink, wink. So the Romans who received the letter understood that he's talking about Shah Sapor making war on the Romans. And then he mentions like King Darius had a helper named the same way as our recent emperor. And the recent emperor of Rome who just died was Antoninus Pius. So the Romans realized Antoninus is the motherfucker who is the defector. So it was all Aesopian tongue. And I was reading this letter and how this letter was put together and what amount of thought went into. And I know that I have to talk about this. And if I don't get to like include it in my own book, I will make a lecture about it. I have to share this stuff. So really, it originates as just something very striking, as a very striking fact. And then I will make a framework around it to give myself an excuse to talk about it. Like Alina is making this like think and drink group, and she is inviting people to speak. And I've been itching to talk about this letter for like 2 years now, ever since I first read about it in Austin and Rankov's book. So in a sense, it's very inductive. Like something makes an impression, and then I look for circumstances to make it work. So I guess in collecting information, it's the same way. I would build a most fucked up structure as long as I get to show the actual pieces which the structure actually serves to carry. I guess you're asking because you're writing a screenplay, and
Yeah, I'm interested in how you find like a kind of a narrative through such a complicated world, and there's so many details of what you've brought to light are so recognizable to us as in shit that's going on right around us right now. It feels like there's a version of this which is like, I don't know, the Born Identity, but period.
yeah.
There's so much behavior, there's so much of the constructs that we've adopted into our societies, and it was obvious in what you were talking about that there are so many parallels, and yet it's so complicated, it's so rich, and I was just wondering about, you kind of answered this, like, how you've sort of chosen to navigate this seems to be, I don't know, it's fascinating.
It can be a little artificial, like finding a framework to go from A, from B, from C. If you want to talk about A, B, and C, it's just like finding a way to get them all, find some connection. But with Romans, it's easy though, because they're so much like us. They're like our mirrors. I didn't even have to like go out of my way, particularly when like these OSS badges and like Frumentari badges, like it's just there, and there is more of it there, I'm sure of it, and there is stuff that nobody even thought of that's there. So yeah, I guess once you start digging, like the deeper you go, the more you start seeing of that sort of stuff. But thanks for the question. And yeah, the Romans are pretty fucking phenomenal, like to say.
So I have another, just since you're very knowledgeable on the subject, I know that the Metropolitan Museum in New York has a really amazing like Roman collection, and so does the Getty Villa in LA. But are there other places like in the US that like are
Well,
worth
you're asking the wrong person. Just as it happens, the lady who is sitting below happens to have a PhD in just that field. Seung-Jong is a Greek and Roman art historian, and I hand the microphone over. Seung-Jong, will you take this?
Sorry, sure. Sorry.
Sure.
Switching back.
I live in
What was the
Boston.
question again?
Which other museums in the United States, other than New York and LA, that maybe we're that have like
There's
good Roman collections?
the Boston Museum of Fine Arts has a pretty good collection. Also, the Getty is huge. Like the Getty has almost even more stuff than the Metropolitan Museum has. Strangely enough, the Cleveland Museum also has quite a bit of stuff. And I mean, there's a lot, but the Getty is something that you must go and see. The Getty Villa, especially, because they model the whole section from a Roman villa, a gigantic one, and they just filled it with the stuff that they got, which is somewhat questionable how it got there, but as long as they check the box that it's been there since 1970, then it's okay. But
Well, I think it still hasn't reopened, as far as I know.
Oh,
Right.
the Getty hasn't? I'm
I don't,
not sure.
I don't think any. I think like museums in California were open for like 2 months or something like that.
Right. The Metropolitan Museum is totally open
Yep.
now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I've been there since the pandemic.
Nice. Oh, so you're New York based?
No, like
Oh.
I went.
Oh.
We went to New York from Boston like in the fall just to, I don't know, just support it, I guess. It's really not hard. It's just
I mean, those are the collections that come to mind, but there are a lot actually. Um,
There's got to be stuff in England. There's got to be
oh no,
phenomenal.
he was talking about the US.
yeah, because we're not going anywhere for a while.
Yeah.
Thank you, Misha. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. It's been a while.
Yep.
Okay. I guess I can ask one last question. So, is there a particular period of Roman history that your book is going to be set in?
So my book takes place in an alternative history environment. It's a Roman Empire that has survived. They have discovered inoculations and vaccinations, and they were able to beat back the Antonine Plague. So the smallpox epidemic has not happened, and the Roman Empire is alive and kicking and doing very well. It's 9th century by our time, but for their time period, it's 1600 since the founding of the city. So there is a great deal of steampunk going on in addition to the Roman side of things. As far as real history is concerned, I always like late Republic because it reminds me of the world in which we live just so much. I mean, I don't even want to go into it because it's so passé, like all these connections. But lately, I've come to, I'm starting to appreciate the Byzantines. I'm starting to really appreciate the Eastern Roman Empire of 5th, 6th, 7th century because it's such a blank slate. Nobody knows anything, and practically everything I read about them is like, wow, really? Like, wow, really? And they are phenomenal. They're very interesting people. They're not your Republican Romans. They're not like Cicero's and Cato's, but they deserve attention just as much. So while that part of Roman history is pretty well studied and known, and there are terrific books written about it, and stories that take place in it, from Silver Pigs to Memoirs of Hadrian. Like right now, I'm kind of on fire about Zeno and Heraclius and the early Byzantine dynasties after the West collapsed and the East was suddenly alone in the world. And yet alone in the world, they managed to overcome all the same obstacles that the West couldn't. They survived the Arabs, and that's a lot because not many states managed that. And they managed to amalgamate the Roman, the traditional, the old, and the more new Christian, and the changing world, and they never lost interest in innovation, and at the same time they never gave up on the classical Greek knowledge they are fascinating people. So right now it's all Eastern Roman for me.
Nice.
Yes, like speaking of the museums, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum is just like amazing.
It's on the bucket list.
And maybe if we're lucky, someone will give a talk on the Byzantine Empire. Who knows?
If someone wants to pick that up, I will carry your briefcase. That would be great. I would love to hear this.
So this is probably a good place to stop. Thank you so much. This was really great.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for asking the wonderful questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was awesome. Thank you.